Why your silence hurts them more than any goodbye. A goodbye is a door closing. It is loud, final, and undeniable. You hear the click of the latch and you know, without question, that the room on the other side is no longer yours to enter. But silence is different. Silence is a door left slightly open in a dark hallway, and the not knowing what lies beyond it becomes far more disturbing than any closed door ever could. Human beings are wired to fear uncertainty more than they fear pain itself. Give a person a clear ending, and they will grieve, adjust, and eventually move forward. Give them silence instead, and you give them an unfinished story their mind will replay endlessly, searching for an ending that never arrives. This is the quiet, uncomfortable truth the Stoics understood about the human mind, though they rarely spoke of it in the language of modern relationships. Epictetus taught that it is not the event itself that disturbs us, but our interpretation of it. A goodbye is an event with a fixed interpretation. It hurts, but it is defined. Silence has no fixed interpretation at all, and so the mind is left to generate its own explanations, most of which are far more painful than the truth could ever be. When you withhold words entirely, you are not being gentle. You are handing someone an empty canvas and forcing them to paint every possible version of rejection onto it themselves. Today we will explore why silence, though it may feel like the softer choice, is often the heaviest weight you can leave in someone's hands. We will look at why the mind cannot rest in ambiguity, why closure is a psychological necessity rather than a luxury, and why the person who disappears without a word often causes more lasting damage than the person who simply says the difficult truth out loud. By the end of this video, you will understand something most people never stop to consider, that walking away in silence is rarely the mercy it appears to be, and that true strength sometimes requires saying the hard thing rather than saying nothing at all. Before we continue, if this kind of reflection speaks to something in you, take a moment to subscribe to Quotes Library. This channel exists to help you understand yourself and the people around you more clearly through timeless philosophy, and every subscription helps this message reach someone who needs it today. Now, let's begin. Truth 1. Goodbye gives them closure, silence gives them questions. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine, built over countless generations to find explanations, causes, and endings. When a relationship, a friendship, or any meaningful connection ends with clear words, the brain receives the information it needs to file the experience away as complete. It hurts, but it is understood. The story has a final chapter, and even a painful final chapter allows the mind to eventually close the book and move towards something new. This is why grief, as devastating as it is, tends to soften with time when there is a clear cause to grieve. Silence denies the brain this closure entirely. When someone disappears without explanation, the mind does not simply accept the absence and move on instead. It enters a loop, constantly searching for the missing piece of information that would allow it to finally understand what happened. Did I do something wrong? Did they meet someone else? Are they hurt, in danger, simply busy, or have they truly decided to leave without a word? Each of these questions remains open indefinitely, and an open question is far harder for the mind to release than a closed, painful truth. This is not merely emotional theory, it reflects something deeply rooted in how memory and attention actually function. Unfinished tasks and unresolved situations occupy a disproportionate amount of mental space compared to completed ones, a phenomenon studied extensively in psychology. A relationship that ends with silence becomes, in a very real sense, an unfinished task. The mind cannot stop returning to. The person left behind does not simply feel sad. They feel suspended, caught in an unresolved loop that a clear goodbye would have prevented entirely. This is why so many people report that the silent disappearance of someone they cared about hurt more deeply and lasted longer than even the most painful breakup conversation they ever had. The words, however difficult, gave their mind somewhere to land. The silence gave them nothing but an open sky with no ground beneath it, and human beings were never built to hover indefinitely in that kind of uncertainty. Truth 2. Words can be argued with, silence cannot be debated. When someone tells you directly why they are leaving, you retain something valuable, even in the pain of the moment, the ability to respond. You can explain yourself, apologize, clarify a misunderstanding, or simply express what the relationship meant to you before it ends. Even if none of this changes the outcome, it gives you a sense of agency in a moment that otherwise feels entirely out of your control. Words, however painful, are an invitation to participate in your own ending. Silence removes this invitation completely. There is no argument to make against an empty phone screen. There is no clarification to offer to someone who has already decided you are unworthy of an explanation. The silent departure strips the other person of any opportunity to respond, to be heard, or to say the things they may have needed to say before the door closed for good. This lack of agency is precisely what makes silence feel so much crueler than words, even when the words themselves would have been difficult to hear. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the difference between what lies within our control and what does not, and there is a version of this wisdom hidden inside the pain of being ghosted or silently abandoned. A clear goodbye, however harsh, at least allows the other person to exercise some control over how they process the ending. Silence removes even that. It forces them into a position of complete powerlessness, left to construct meaning entirely on their own, without a single piece of information from the one person who could have provided it honestly. There is a reason unresolved endings are studied so extensively by psychologists working with grief and trauma. The absence of a final conversation does not simply delay healing, it often distorts it, leaving the person to invent their own narrative about what went wrong, a narrative that is frequently far crueler to themselves than the truth would have been. Silence does not protect the other person from pain. It simply removes their ability to process that pain in a healthy, complete way. Truth 3. Silence denies them the reaction they deserve to see. There is an unspoken belief many people carry when they choose silence over a direct conversation, the belief that avoiding the conversation avoids the pain altogether, for both parties. This belief is almost always false. What actually happens is that the pain is not avoided, only relocated and intensified. And beyond the pain itself, silence denies the other person something psychologically significant: the ability to witness your reaction, your accountability, and your acknowledgement of the impact this ending has on their life. Human beings are deeply relational creatures, and much of our healing after loss comes not simply from understanding what happened, but from witnessing that the other person understands what happened too. When someone ends things with clear, honest words, even words delivered with difficulty and imperfection, the other person receives a form of validation, proof that their feelings, their presence, and their experience within the relationship mattered enough to deserve acknowledgement. Silence withholds this validation entirely, leaving the other person to wonder whether they mattered at all. This does not mean every ending requires an elaborate, drawn-out conversation. Some endings are best kept brief, direct, and free of unnecessary detail. But brevity delivered with honesty is entirely different from silence delivered as avoidance. A short, honest sentence acknowledging the end of something meaningful can provide more genuine closure than an elaborate explanation given days or weeks too late, after the other person has already spent countless hours constructing their own painful theories about what happened and why. Seneca wrote extensively about the discipline required to face difficult truths directly rather than avoiding them, and this discipline applies as much to how we end relationships as to how we face our own mortality. Choosing silence over honesty is often not an act of kindness at all, despite how it may be framed internally. It is frequently an act of self-protection disguised as consideration for the other person, a way of avoiding the discomfort of their reaction while telling yourself you are sparing them from something painful. If this is resonating with you, this is exactly the kind of reflection Quotes Library was created to offer. Subscribing helps this channel continue producing content that helps people understand themselves and their relationships more honestly. Consider joining the community if you have not already. Truth 4. Goodbye feels like rejection. Silence feels like erasure. There is a meaningful psychological difference between being rejected and being erased, and understanding this difference reveals exactly why silence cuts so much deeper than even the most painful goodbye. Rejection, however devastating, still acknowledges your existence and your significance. Someone looked at you, considered the relationship, and made a decision, however difficult that decision was to receive. Erasure offers no such acknowledgement. It suggests, whether intentionally or not, that you were never significant enough to warrant even the smallest gesture of closure. This is the story of a woman named Ngozi, who spent nearly 2 years building a close friendship with a colleague named Bassi after they worked together on a difficult project that neither of them could have completed alone. They shared meals, celebrated victories, and supported each other through personal struggles neither shared with anyone else at their company. When Bassi suddenly left the company for a new position, Ngozi expected the friendship to continue, perhaps in a different form, given everything they had built together. Instead, Bassi's messages slowed, then stopped entirely, with no explanation offered despite Ngozi reaching out several times over the following months. Ngozi later described this period as one of the most confusing emotional experiences of her adult life, not because the friendship ended, but because she never understood why. She replayed their final conversations obsessively, searching for a mistake she might have made, a comment that might have offended him, anything that could explain the sudden and complete silence. Years later, she encountered a mutual acquaintance who mentioned, almost in passing, that Bassi had simply found it easier to let old connections fade quietly as he moved into his new life rather than have difficult conversations about drifting apart. There had been no offense, no betrayal, no mistake on Ngozi's part at all, simply an avoidance so complete that it left her constructing false narratives about her own worth for years. Ngozi's story illustrates something crucial about the nature of silent endings. The absence of explanation does not simply withhold information. It actively invites the other person to fill that void with self-blame, often for far longer and far more intensely than the truth, however uncomfortable, ever would have caused. A brief, honest conversation from Bassi would have spared Ngozi years of quiet self-doubt. His silence, chosen precisely to avoid discomfort, ultimately created a far deeper and more lasting wound than any direct conversation ever could have. Truth 5. Silence forces them to face a mirror you never provided. When someone leaves your life with clear, direct words, they leave you with an external explanation to process. Even if that explanation is painful, it originates from outside yourself. But when someone leaves through silence, the absence of an external explanation forces the person left behind to turn inward, searching their own behavior, their own worth, and their own perceived flaws for an explanation that was never actually theirs to find. This is one of the cruelest, though often unintentional, effects of choosing silence over honesty. This inward searching rarely produces accurate conclusions. Left without information, the human mind tends toward the most self-critical explanations available, assuming personal inadequacy long before considering that the other person's silence may have had nothing to do with them at all. A person may spend months or even years believing they were too much, too difficult, too unlovable to deserve an explanation, when in reality the silence had everything to do with the other person's own discomfort, fear, or avoidance and nothing to do with the value or worth of the person left behind. This is precisely why choosing honesty, even difficult honesty, is ultimately a far kinder act than choosing silence, despite how counterintuitive this may initially seem. A direct conversation, however uncomfortable to deliver, prevents the other person from constructing false narratives about their own inadequacy. It replaces guesswork with truth, and even painful truth is almost always more bearable than the elaborate, self-blaming stories the mind constructs when left without any information at all. The Stoics valued truth above comfort in nearly every circumstance, understanding that temporary discomfort delivered honestly almost always produces better long-term outcomes than temporary comfort built on avoidance. Choosing silence to avoid a difficult conversation may feel easier in the moment, but it frequently transfers a far heavier and more prolonged burden onto the person left behind, one they did not choose and did not deserve to carry. Truth 6. A clear ending allows healing, silence delays it indefinitely. Healing requires a starting point, and a starting point requires clarity. When a relationship, friendship, or connection ends with clear words, however painful, the person left behind can begin the process of grieving immediately. They know what they lost, they understand why, and they can begin the difficult but forward-moving process of accepting the loss and eventually building something new. Silence denies this starting point entirely, leaving the person suspended in a state of ambiguous loss that psychologists recognize as uniquely difficult to heal from. Ambiguous loss, unlike a clearly defined ending, does not allow the mind to move through the natural stages of grief in any coherent order, because the mind is never entirely certain the loss is even final. A person left in silence often oscillates between grieving and hoping, unable to fully release the relationship because no clear ending has ever been confirmed. This oscillation can continue for months or even years, far longer than the grief that follows a clearly stated goodbye, precisely because the uncertainty itself prevents genuine closure from ever forming. There is a reason many therapists specifically recommend seeking clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, over prolonged uncertainty when processing the end of any significant relationship. Clarity, however painful, allows the nervous system to eventually settle into acceptance. Uncertainty keeps the nervous system in a state of low-grade alertness indefinitely, constantly scanning for new information that might resolve the unanswered question at the center of the loss. This is not simply emotional discomfort, it carries a genuine physiological cost, one that silence perpetuates far longer than honesty ever would. If you have ever been on the receiving end of this kind of silence, understand that the confusion and pain you experienced were not signs of your own weakness or excessive sensitivity. They were the natural, predictable response of a mind denied the closure it needed to heal. And if you have ever been the one choosing silence to avoid a difficult conversation, understand that the discomfort of honesty, however real, is almost always a smaller burden than the prolonged confusion silence leaves behind in someone who once mattered to you. Every truth we have explored today points toward the same conclusion. Silence may feel like the path of least resistance, the gentler choice, the way to avoid inflicting pain on someone you may have cared about deeply. But the pain silence avoids in the moment is rarely eliminated. It is simply transferred, prolonged, and often intensified in the hands of the person left behind, who must now construct their own explanation for an ending they were never given the honesty to properly understand. This does not mean every difficult conversation must be lengthy, dramatic, or perfectly delivered. It simply means that even brief, imperfect honesty is almost always a kinder gift than a silence that stretches on indefinitely, leaving someone to wonder, doubt, and question their own worth long after you have already moved forward with your own life. If you are facing an ending that requires this kind of honesty, remember that the discomfort you feel in speaking the truth is temporary. The confusion your silence would leave behind in someone else could last far longer than you ever intended. And if you are the one who has experienced this kind of silence from someone who once mattered to you, release the belief that their silence was ever a measure of your worth. It was never about you deserving less. It was about their own discomfort, their own avoidance, and their own inability to face what honesty required of them. You do not need their explanation to move forward. You only need to recognize that the story their silence left unfinished was never yours to complete alone. If this video helped you see something more clearly today, do not scroll away without subscribing to Quotes Library. This channel is dedicated to helping you understand yourself and the people around you through timeless wisdom, and every subscription genuinely helps this message reach someone who needs to hear it. Share this with someone who has been sitting in unanswered silence. Leave a comment with the truth that resonated with you most, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you for spending this time with us today. Keep becoming.